Good morning, everybody. Take another minute, let everybody get in. Okay, good morning, everybody. Let's call the meeting to order. This is the January 6th meeting of the Transportation Technical Advisory Committee. We're continuing to meet virtually. The instructions on how to join the meeting, if you'd like to make public comment, are on the screen. You can also call in by phone. And remember to use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute. Bella, if you'd please call the roll.
All right, Jeremy Keene.
Present.
Corey Aldridge.
Present.
Shane Stack. Sarah Cofield.
Present.
Ellen Buchanan.
Present.
Aaron Pehan. Jacqueline Smith.
Present.
Chet Krauser.
Karen Hughes, proxy for Chet Krauser.
Thank you. Juniper Davis.
Present.
Donna Gawker.
Grant Carlton, proxy for Donna Gockler.
Thank you. Ryan Hammond.
I'm present.
Lynn Hellegard.
Present.
Ben Weiss.
Present.
Ian Ortlieb.
Present.
Brian Elstad. Bynum Jackson. Eva Rock. Katie Potts.
This is Vicky Cernich, proxy for Katie Potts.
Thank you. And lastly, Emily Brock. All right, that's all.
Thank you. For the record, I see Shane Stack is on the call.
Yeah, thanks, Jeremy. I was just going to jump in. I appreciate that.
Okay. So we have approval of minutes from our December 2nd meeting. Any corrections to the minutes? Okay, seeing none, those will stand approved. Any public comment on items not on the agenda? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to our new business. We have elections of a new chair and vice chair. I'll ask Aaron just to give us a quick background on how we've typically done this in the past. It's been a rotating position.
Yeah, we've gone through a cycle, rotating through city, county, MUTD, Mr. TMA, and city, county health department, and just have a rotation of chairs. And so if we follow that same rotation, Corey would move into chair from vice chair, and I think next up would be Lynn Hellegard from Mr. TMA. So I've shared the kind of historic rotation of chair and vice chair in the agenda, but obviously we don't necessarily have to stick with that. So that would just be if we wanted to continue on and make it easy and continue on that same path and rotation. So I'll leave it at that.
Okay, so I think we're looking for nominations for chair and vice chair. I'll note that looking at that list, Lynn Helgard is one of our longest serving members. So thanks, Lynn, for that service and long-term commitment to this committee.
You're more than welcome.
Well, Jeremy, I guess I'd make the motion that Corey becomes chair and Lynn's vice chair.
Thanks, Shane.
Second.
Okay, any additional nominations? Seeing none, I'll just do a quick check to make sure that Corey and Lynn are willing to serve in that capacity.
Yes, I'm willing.
Yes, I'm willing.
Great, thank you both. Okay, let's just do our voice vote. All those in favor of those committee nominations, say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, thank you both for taking those roles, and I think this is the moment I get to just hand it off to you, Corey, right?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you.
I'm happy to assist with this meeting if you need it.
Okay, great. Looks like Emily Brock just joined us. Make a note of that.
Sorry.
So, all right. Well, thank you. Can't believe it's been 5-6 years since I last chaired. It seems like it's only a couple years ago. All right, so let's move on to the next agenda item, which is discussion on opportunities for emerging mobility in Missoula. Aaron?
Yeah, so this is a follow-up of our presentation that we made last month. We had a little bit of discussion at the end of that presentation, and then at least some folks on the committee were interested in continuing that. And so I'm going to, I guess, just as a heads up, my goal for TTAC today is to be done by 11. There's some of you have conflicts at 11, and I do as well. So just that note on agenda time. But for this particular one, I wanted to give a quick recap of what we presented, or sort of at the end of how to start thinking about implementing emerging mobility or tackling it, and then open it up for any discussion. And I've got a couple of questions or prompts to hopefully get that going, and have more of a conversation with TTAC today, and just thinking about where we want to go next as a community, relating to all of these different new technologies and new opportunities and new modes. So, hold on one second. Just want to share my screen here if I can. All right. So just as a quick reminder of where we left things off around emerging mobility last month, we were talking about how to set ourselves up for success when we start tackling these new modes and new technologies. And there were sort of 3 stages that are in the emerging mobility playbook that we want to follow. And those start with setting the foundation. So making sure we have the right goals, and that our policies are in alignment, and that we're thinking about these modes and technologies as tools to help us achieve our goals. And so being really clear in what those goals are and how these might fit into those objectives. And then the next step is to start taking action through thinking about pilots and partnerships, and how can we start getting some of these things off the ground and do it intentionally, and not be sort of passive and letting things happen, and not being able to control how those are helping us meet our goals. And then the third step is to make sure that we are evaluating and setting good metrics for understanding where we're going with any new mobility that we're piloting or seeing come up in our community. So again, being intentional, trying to learn lessons from those pilots, and then shift our focus if we need to, or make adjustments as necessary. So again, similar to how we do planning work, but just being intentional about how and forward thinking in terms of emerging mobility. So each one of those each one of those steps along the way have a number of different opportunities that we can start working on. So when we're setting the foundation, it's really key that we're engaging the right folks, that we're having the right partners, and thinking about broadly about our principles and how we want those goals to improve Missoula as a community, and who needs to be involved in that. So thinking about roles, whether it's government agencies or community partners, nonprofits, whoever that might be. And as we're thinking about taking action, again, there's a number of different steps that we can do within that. So one of those is having pilots and testing out new emerging mobility in a more controlled environment, or a more controlled way, but also making sure we're coordinating with those partners that we've identified in that goal setting phase. That could be nonprofit, it could be private companies like Bird or Lime, or those scooter and e-bike share programs that are out there. And we're also making sure that we're connecting with our peers and doing some work on working with communities who have already done some of these pilots and learning from what they've done. And then finally, when we're thinking about applying our lessons, making sure that we have, first off, good metrics. So understanding what we can measure and how those relate back to our goals, that we're collecting the information during pilots or as things start to come online, and that we're doing that evaluation so that we can adjust, repeat, and change direction if we need to. So again, this is kind of the framework that we've set up in the Emerging Mobility Playbook as we think about where we want to go next as a community. And then as we're thinking about pilots, these can be really useful ways to take a new technology or a new tool and test it out and see how it's working. And we really want to start with a good foundation so we understand what that tool is and what we want to get out of it, how it relates to our goals, how it relates to our transportation system. We want to plan through and be thorough in how we're organizing that pilot. Obviously, then you want to launch it, have some on the ground experience and how you're operating, and then bringing it back to the evaluation as you collect data and monitor how it's going as a pilot. And then you do that evaluation, and that can help you move back to the beginning if you need to. If all is going well, then you expand. If not, you come back, reconsider our understanding of that, and go through this process again to make sure we're trying to get it right. So bringing all of that together in the plan, we have an outline of some ideas in the Emerging Mobility Playbook of where we can start to tackle emerging mobility that might be ongoing opportunities. One of the first steps, and not that you need to read this on the slide, but just to show how this is laid out in the plan, one of those first opportunities is to try to create a unified set of principles around emerging mobility. So thinking clearly about how we want new tools and technology and mobility, new modes to fit into our existing transportation system, and what goals we want to try to achieve through that. So that is part of that setting the foundation, and something that we will need to identify who needs to be involved in that policy setting, and who is making those decisions, what needs to be officially adopted policy, and what is just more guidelines that we can have at our disposal for managing those new pilots. So there's a whole list I can in the emerging mobility that related to each of our long-range transportation plan goals that we can go through, and there's a number of different opportunities in each of those steps along the way. We've got some pilots I think they're already underway that we could learn from, and that might be something to discuss today or one of the questions that we have today, or what are we already doing that we can fit into this framework and build upon. So a lot of information there. We don't necessarily need to go through all of that today, but just wanted to bring us up to speed on where we might be at today in terms of a discussion. So some of the questions I have, and that might be able to get us started on a conversation on where we can go with this emerging mobility playbook and thinking about next steps. One is, what are our current efforts that are underway? I know there are a lot of things happening in the community. There are some things that started and stalled out, like the scooter share and bike share. There was a lot of interest pre-COVID that went to city council. I think there was a lot of hesitation, particularly on scooters, that maybe we don't have the right infrastructure, or that there were a lot of concerns about safety. And so that's something that we started to develop policy around how to launch a pilot. City Council was not interested at the time or had enough concerns that they didn't want to move forward with it. And so that's something that we've already done some work, but is in sort of a pause. But there's still interest out there that we do get regular inquiries from those companies wanting to come to Missoula. Other efforts that are underway are the county, and I think this is sort of peripherally related, but is a unique way to think about it. The county shifting to a sort of a fleet management system for their fleet vehicles in order to more quickly electrify their fleet. So going to all electric through a company who will then manage those fleet vehicles rather than purchasing them individually. So that's an opportunity or a way that we can think about, electric vehicles. How do we get that? How to accelerate adoption of electric vehicles? And that's an innovative way that we can think about it. Another question that I have is, who needs to be involved in discussion? So if we're setting up working groups or forums for discussing emerging mobility, who needs to be involved in that discussion, both from a government side and from our community partners? And then lastly, what are some opportunities for pilot programs that we could initiate in the near future? And maybe those are opportunities because they are something like scooters, because there are companies that are out there just waiting to come to Missoula, or maybe it's an opportunity that something like car share, where we've had a lot of conversations through other projects, that feels like Missoula is in a place that is ripe for trying out car share. And is that the right opportunity to move forward with, or are there others that we should be focused on? So that is all I have in my presentation. I can leave these up, or we can have these be questions to get us started, but I'm just curious to hear from this committee what your thoughts are in terms of, especially what current efforts are underway. You all represent a lot of different stakeholders, and then particularly opportunities for pilots and who might need to be involved. So I'll leave it at that and see what your thoughts are. Again, we don't have to tackle all of this, but just starting the conversation and maybe thinking about what our next steps are. So that I'll turn it over to committee, and I can bring up any graphics if we want to return to some of those questions or information that's in the emerging mobility playbook.
Okay, great. Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, I think this is actually a really good topic that we should really be talking about. We could spend some quality time in TTAC really focusing on this. That's great. Be in the chair, I can just talk whenever I want to. One of the innovative programs that we first did was our Zero Fare back in 2015. And it was highly successful. It really increased mobility and getting people out of their vehicles and around the community. And I know at Mountain Line, we're really interested in what are the next innovative programs that we can do that help get people around and increase mobility. There's so much opportunity. There have been lots of communities that have tried various things, but we have a real great opportunity to really think outside the box and be really creative. So, Ben, you had your hand up.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. Just one quick additional comment about the scooters and other low speed mobility options is that just in the intervening 3 years since this was at council, personal adoption has increased significantly. And so even if we weren't talking about a private company come in, I think that there's work to be done to recognize just how many people have bought their own electric scooters or one wheels or electric unicycles or whatever else is out there now. And so there's certainly work to be done, policy work to be done around kind of low speed electrified vehicles. And then the other comment I had was more of a question. Aaron, that spreadsheet on that second to last, that example spreadsheet, this is more of a process question. Who is filling that in? And is there a work team that is being set up around just kind of setting that foundation for as many of these as possible? Or is that what we're doing today? Or how do you envision multiple, like a work team for each potential opportunity, or what is your thinking process wise there?
It's a good question. What's currently in there are concepts or opportunities that we identified during the long range transportation plan update. So working with Nelson Nygaard, they helped us sort of start to fill that out on where we could focus our efforts initially, sort of in the next 2 years, 2 to 4 years, and then 3 to 5. So it's kind of a 2 to 5 year plan for how to get started on this. As far as implementing it, I mean, I think some work groups would be really helpful, and maybe it starts with one to identify our initial priorities, or maybe, TTAC could even say, here's our, based on what we're doing today and what we know, here are the things that we should pursue as initial opportunities. And then we set up a work team around each one of those, depending on who needs to be involved. Because I think it could vary, not everyone needs to be involved in it or should be involved in those, but I think it just depends on what we're working on. So something like car share might have very different work group than, say, e-scooter policy adoption. So I think that's some of the feedback we're looking for now. Like what should our priorities be, and who should be involved in those? Or at least starting to have the discussion.
Great. So should we talk about anything that's going on right now, project-wise, first, and then get into like talking about what the next thing should be? Because I don't know. I'm not sure what programs are going on or what innovation is being worked on currently.
Yeah, I think an initial discussion of what we're already working on would be really helpful, just to know, and then building on that in terms of what are our next opportunities.
And I guess the word innovation isn't necessarily, maybe misleading. We're trying to solve problems as well. Like the floaters, on the river out in East Missoula. I know that's a big concern to the county and others, and trying to find a good solution for that. Anyone else?
Corey, I'd like to just share a couple examples of things we've been working on at the city that I would consider pilot projects.
Great.
One of them is this neighborhood traffic management program, and in particular, these quick build traffic calming devices that we've been deploying. And that's a way of responding quickly to identified crash problems or citizen concerns. And we're kind of right in the middle of that. We've been doing it for a couple of years, and we're at the stage now where we can start to evaluate, collect some data, see how well they're working, see if we're getting the desired effect. But that was a project that allowed us to deploy those things cheaply, in the hundreds of dollars rather than thousands to address issues. And then we can look at longer term projects that would do permanent infrastructure with those. The other one was we called it a hybrid mini roundabout. It was a project we put in at the corner of Wyoming and California Street, where we did a very low cost roundabout traffic circle that didn't modify any of the corners. It just put the circle in the center, and we used some delineators to do the splitter islands. And we did an engineering study on that, and then did some follow-up study, and we're continuing to monitor it, see how well it's working. But that was also a fairly effective low-cost solution that I think is a good pilot example. So just to get the committee thinking about some of the things we could do with pilots. And Aaron, I'm very interested in the car share idea. I think that's a great one to look at a pilot for, and maybe couple that with a parking reduction benefit that maybe we can work that into code that would have the ability to do a car share instead of certain number of parking spaces. And that could be something we could look at how effective that would be.
Yeah.
Good, thanks, Jeremy. Yeah, it'd be interesting to know. I mean, some projects, innovative projects, I think are going to be more costly. Some may be really low dollar amount, which would be fantastic. I know one of the things that we're doing is our bus stop improvement project. So trying to make things more accessible and easier to use for Missoulians. And their car share has been talked about for years. And it seems to be the one that's talked about the most among most groups. And that one I think would be really good for us to really flesh out and see if it's actually going to something we could actually do rather than just continuing to hear about talking about it, the possibility.
Hey, Corey,
Anyone
this
else?
is Lynn, just from a historical standpoint, since I've been here the longest. When we looked at that before, Enterprise was more than happy to do that. It was just very cost prohibitive at the time.
Okay, that's good to know. Thanks, Lynn.
Just to maybe throw another question out there, I'd be curious on the electric vehicle side. We're seeing a lot of potential investment from the federal government. So starting to think about what we need. I'd be curious, one, from the MDT folks online, if there is any work happening at the state level on what that might look like and what it means. And then if there's any work at the city or county level on developing a plan for how to capitalize on that funding to build out public infrastructure for vehicle charging. And then I guess related to that, one of the questions I've had is on the code side. So thinking about if we're moving towards electric vehicles and we're eliminating or reducing parking spaces, or if we're building higher density and say we're building houses without garages or without off-street parking spaces, where does the charging infrastructure go for someone who has an electric vehicle? Can that go in the right of way? What's our policy around that type of charging infrastructure if it's not available to someone at their residence? Where are they charging? And if they're parking that vehicle on the street, how are we going to charge electric vehicles with on-street parking? I think is a question that I think there's a lot of questions around electrification that we need to start tackling. So be curious if there's been any discussion outside of this group on how that might work, particularly at the state level or capitalizing on federal dollars.
Hi, Erin, this is Vicky, and to attempt to answer your question, I know at the state level, the groups have just been formed to start looking through bill and figuring out how it is that we are going to tackle these things.
Thanks, Vicky.
Something I saw on a show I was watching over in England, and it would be neat if we could do this. They actually basically use jumper cables, but they have jumper cables in their street lights. So my thought was, wouldn't that be great if we could figure out how to retrofit those chargers into our street lamps, because the electricity is already there and it might be more cost effective.
Katie, did you have a question?
Thanks, Erin. I just wanted to piggyback a little bit on on Vicky's comment as well from the state level. And we are, we've formed kind of smaller working groups to dig through each different section of bill and are really kind of highlighting changes, new eligibilities, any new requirements. And then there is some work going on with DEQ as well in terms of electrification, because of course the energy grid comes into play and how we can support that, or how the energy grid can really support the charging of electric vehicles. So that is some ongoing work. And then from the state side, and of course, this is just kind of my cursory level understanding. I'm sure there's going to be a lot more that comes along with it. The state side's focus is really going to be kind of along the interstate and how we can accommodate charging of vehicles as you kind of do that through movement through the state of Montana. And then of course, there's the RFI that's out right now with FHWA to kind of look at what all needs to go into this type of infrastructure, what kinds of things have have anybody thought about when that kind of RFI is open to really anybody as part of the general public or city, county, state folks. And then, of course, the grant opportunities that are there, discretionary funding that are there for kind of more of our local communities, city, county governments to install that type of infrastructure as well on the local road network. So there's a lot of moving parts, and I do think we're moving closer to having a better understanding of it. And of course, the tie-in with DEQ as well, in terms of the energy grid.
Yeah.
Aaron, can you pull those questions back up again? That you
Yeah,
had?
I can.
Yeah.
So maybe a question is, next step, do we keep this on the agenda for TTAC as a whole to continue discussing, and we can kind of do some interim work on a few next steps and bring it back? Or is it worth having a smaller working group that could get together and start establishing those next steps, and then have more of a broader discussion at TTAC, or sort of a support, don't support kind of refinement at TTAC?
A great question. I would be in favor of us creating a smaller committee to at least come up with a list of ideas or things to think about that we can bring back to TTAC. And I would be happy to serve on that. I don't know what's the size of it should be, but it's important to Mountain Line, so it would be worth the time.
Right. Well, if that's that may be a great sort of first next step, is to I pull a smaller group together, really dive into having an in-depth discussion just on what our next opportunities are, and bring that back. And then we can pull it. The other opportunity there is we can pull in some other partners who are potentially working on this stuff too, and involve them in the discussion. Thinking of, like the city and the county sustainability folks who may be working on some of this at some capacity, or other community partners.
That's great. So is TTAC, is anybody opposed to us creating a smaller committee to work on this? And we'll identify the people to participate outside of this meeting today. No? All right. I'd say if you're really interested in serving on this committee, I think it would be a value. I would get a hold of Aaron, let him know.
Yep, and I'll reach out to some folks too, and try to pull something together in the next month or so.
Okay. Right. Anyone else while we're still on this topic? Okay, then we will move on to, looks like we'll move on to old business. Infrastructure bill update from Charlie.
Hello, y'all hear me all right?
Yep.
Awesome. Go ahead and share my screen. Y'all seeing my screen? Awesome, great. So yeah, we were planning on presenting this topic, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, last month, but we didn't get to it. And we thought that would be a good thing because there's been rapid developments and available information on this act. Unfortunately, there hasn't been any major updates, but we've made some changes to the presentation. And for a general sort of idea of how we want to present this is that this is the available information now, and we plan to bring forward information as it becomes available. The flow of this presentation, I'm going to go over sort of nationwide funding and program changes. I'm sure you all are aware of a lot of this information, benefits for Montana, and then the projected benefits that we see and know for the Missoula area. Primary focus of the Missoula area is new and expanded competitive grants that we will be able to apply for. So the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or the bipartisan infrastructure law, came into law in the middle of November of last year and has authorized over $1.2 trillion for several infrastructure areas, transportation being a large one, expansion of a nationwide broadband network, improvement to our water infrastructure, green energy infrastructure, disaster mitigation resiliency, as well as improvements to our nationwide cybersecurity infrastructure. There has been $284 billion more funds authorized for transportation compared to the FAST Act. Changes in transportation funds. There's a general retaining of existing federal highway programs with a significant increase in the amount of funds compared to the FAST Act reauthorization. And in fiscal year 2022, there's over $50 billion, and this will receive a 2% increase to reflect inflation through fiscal year 2026, seeing almost $57 billion. The 5-year total is over $270 billion of authorized funds. The new transportation funding breakdown. So in this accounting, there's $284 billion of newly authorized funds for transportation projects. A large chunk of that, over $100 billion, is for roadways and bridges, an encouraging increase in committed funds of $11 billion for safety-oriented projects, almost $40 billion for transit, and almost $70 billion for rail infrastructure. I'm sure Commissioner Strohmeyer is excited about that one. There's new funding sections for electrical vehicle charging of almost $8 billion, so that can benefit our emerging mobility programs. There's new bridge funding of almost $30 billion, and this is formula funding, so this can be funneled down to Missoula area and the state of Montana, as well as a bridge investment program that contains competitive grants for bridge repairs of almost $13 billion. Public transit funds have seen an astronomical increase of nearly $70 billion committed, which represents a 40% increase over FAST Act levels. I'm sure Corey has an eye on what this means for Mountain Line. Over $33.5 billion of urbanized area formula grants, almost $20 billion of state of good repair programs for upgrading older rail and bus systems in urbanized areas, which is directly applicable to Mountain Line, and almost $5 billion for public transit in rural areas. Sorry, I'm in a house with dogs because I'm working remotely today, so there will be some noise. We also have rail funds of almost $70 billion, which is more than $50 billion dedicated to Amtrak. Of this, over half of that, being $36 billion, is directed to the Northeast Corridor, and $16 billion is allocated towards Amtrak's national network. We also have the Chrissy grant, which I know that this Big Sky Passenger Rail Authority has an eye on. Sorry about that. Are you all still able to hear me through that noise? Okay, my apologies. New home and staying home from work. Roadway safety, there's more than $10 billion committed to roadway safety. An encouraging program is $5 billion for a Safe Streets and Roads for All program. And this will fund Vision Zero plans and I don't know how problematic that is.
Well, I'd say, let me know if you want me to jump in at any point, Charlie, if it gets too noisy.
Okay. No, they're settling down. So there's $5 billion that's being set aside for Safe Streets and Roads for All program, and this is a competitive grant to fund Vision Zero oriented programs, and I'll touch on what this may mean for the Missoula area. And then $2 billion in new funds, the National Highway and Traffic Safety Administration, which will include the development of new mandates for specific safety regulations, one to expand upon determination of driver impairment, ensuring greater childhood safety through proper seating, and then development of new safety regulations for new vehicles on the road, one including automatic braking and lane departure warning and keeping assistance systems. Something that I thought was interesting that I don't think we are able to take advantage of locally, but is the development of user fee programs of $50 million over 5 years for new pilot programs to explore the use of per mile user fees to bolster the Highway Trust Fund, and $75 million over 5 years to reauthorize and expand a separate program grants for the usage of fee pilot programs. So ways of rethinking how we fund our roadway infrastructure in this country. And then other areas that are less applicable to the Missoula area, aviation, which will receive $25 billion, although we do have an international airport, so there may be applicable grants there. And then inland waterways receiving over $6.5 billion for expansion of those infrastructure systems. So what does this mean for Montana? Montana is likely to receive over $3 billion over this 5-year act, which represents over a 26% increase over FAST Act levels of funding. And we have a brief briefing on what amounts of funds this will mean at the state level. And we're unsure how exactly this will funnel down to the Missoula area. But from what we understand now, existing sort of division systems that MDT has in place will determine how those highway and various funding programs will be divvied up to the Missoula area. So almost $70 million over the first 5 years are expected to reduce transportation related infrastructure or related emissions. So you can think CMAQ funds, almost $80 million over 5 years to increase the resiliency of our transportation system. We have $15 million in formula funding over the 5 years for the highway safety traffic programs. And this is almost a 30% increase over the FAST Act levels of funding. $158 million over the 5 years to improve public transportation options, representing a 37% increase over FAST Act levels. Over $40 million over the 5 years for electrical vehicle charging network within the state. And I'm sure some of this can assist in emerging mobility programs, as we were just discussing. Almost $150 million for infrastructure development in airports over 5 years. So some of this could be applicable to maybe Swatupkin area projects. So what does this mean for the Missoula area? We're still determining exactly how this will play out and the levels of funding that we may see in discretionary funding. We do have some insights to how Buy and Hire America may change, and we have several competitive grant opportunities that are encouraging. So from what we know now, and I may have Vicki and Aaron step in on this, is that Buy and Hire America Act, there may be reissue of waivers, and this could affect the street sweepers and leasing project within our current CMAQ tip section. Right now, the plan was to bypass this waiver through leasing street sweepers, but there may be waivers available, so purchasing street sweepers could become realistic in the next year or so. So there's discussion of how that may be handled. There's several grants. This first slide of competitive grants is ones I identified as being most applicable for the Missoula area. So the Safe Streets and Roads for All program is a new competitive grant that has $6 billion authorized towards it. And as previously mentioned, it's directed towards funding Vision Zero plans and their related improvements. We are unsure after taking watching a Safe Streets and Roads for All webinar if our CTSP or Community Transportation Safety Program acts as a Vision Zero plan, or if we would need to expand upon this to then get direct funding for our identified projects for this grant program. We also have the Rebuilding America Infrastructure with Sustainability and Equity grant. There's several projects of regional significance that we have identified in our long-range transportation plan that we believe are able to be funded. And this is an expanded program. So it previously existed, but it now has $15 billion of committed funds. The infra grant as well, and it's been discussed in TTAC and several other meetings. Infrastructure for Rebuilding America grants is directed towards freight infrastructure. And there's several trestles as well as crossings that have been identified as potential applicable projects for this grant opportunity. The Strengthening Mobility and Revolutionizing Transportation or SMART grant has $1 billion, and it is a new grant program. I've identified this grant program as something that could be useful for funding projects like Higgins or the Brooks TOD Corridor project or Russell Street projects. I think those are large projects that could use grant funding for assistance. This next batch of grants is transit oriented. So all of these grants are either new or expanded and offer opportunities to improve upon grants or grant funded transit projects. So the low and no emissions bus programs is an opportunity to improve upon Mountain Line's bus fleet. The buses and bus facilities competitive grant is an opportunity to apply for funding to improve upon the status and state of our various bus stops. All station accessibility is a new grant program of almost $2 billion. And it focuses on improving the accessibility or infrastructure surrounding the bus network. The capital investment grants has over $23 billion, and this is expanded grant, so it's previously existing. And it's focused on investing in high capacity transit projects. So I'm not quite sure if Mountain Line's transit network directly applies to this. Corey may have a comment on that, but it is a massive competitive transit. And then we have an aviation grant that may be applicable for projects surrounding Missoula International Airport. This next batch of grants includes sort of less directly applicable to the Missoula area, as well as one grant section that may be used for funding our emerging mobility projects. So the competitive grants for nationally significant bridges. I am not exactly sure the distinction between nationally significant, but I do know that we have several bridges that are within the national highway system. So these are large projects bundled with smaller bridge projects to be eligible for funding. And this is a new program, almost $13 billion. The charging and fueling infrastructure discretionary grant of up to $2.5 billion of new funding. So I think this could be an opportunity to get direct funding for the planning and infrastructure of charging infrastructure across the Missoula area. Reconnecting Communities pilot program could be an opportunity to fund some of the pilot program state emerging mobility programs that we have. So part of our emerging mobility playbook is that a lot of those projects would be fulfilled through a pilot-oriented method. So testing out their eligibility and seeing how they function before moving them to a permanent status. And then the FHWA, Nationally Significant Federal and Tribal Lands projects. So this would be projects that increase accessibility to federal and tribal lands. And we are a land surrounded by several bodies of federal land designations. Lastly, and this is sort of a broad touch note, is that the MPO is almost indefinitely to experience an increase in discretionary funds. You can think our CMAQ and urban funds. Right now, we are unsure at the levels of what those will be. But it is encouraging to know that MDT's existing formulas for divvying up discretionary funds will be applicable. And once we are aware of what those funding levels will be, we can calculate out to see what our discretionary funds will look like for CMAQ and urban funds. And that is what I have for a brief update. I think a question that I have for you all before we get into discussion is if there's any areas in this presentation that you would like a more in-depth touch as information becomes available, that would be useful for guiding what we research and come back to you all with.
Okay, great. Thanks, Charlie. A lot of money, a lot of opportunity. Anybody have questions or comments on this? Go ahead, Jeremy.
Thanks, Corey. I think my takeaway from this is there's a lot of opportunities. We should get projects ready. So I think we should spend some time identifying which projects we would want to prioritize and then figure out which grants best fit and apply for those. I think there's a few cases where we might want to tailor a project for a specific grant, but it looks to me like we have projects already in the pipeline that would be eligible for multiple grant opportunities. So I think it's going to be more a case of trying to figure out which ones we want to apply for and start the work on getting those grant applications together.
Okay. Thanks, Jeremy. Let's see. Got a bunch of hands raised here. Ryan?
Sure. So I guess I was about to say just what Jeremy just said, that, I think it's worthwhile to start thinking strategically about which above and beyond opportunities to shoot for. Make sure your planning docs are in order and all the rest to support that. And then Charlie at one point said, in this accounting and then so forth. And that's one of the, a lot of the questions I've gotten so far about the content of the bill and questions along, well, really, how much extra money is this? Because there's a lot of things in the larger infrastructure bill that can be fairly classed as a transportation dollar or not, depending on the actual project. A lot of the stuff, and they're about resiliency, for example. Sometimes you'll see a top line dollar amount with some of the, electronic vehicle charging infrastructure included, sometimes not. And depending on who you are, that is an appropriate accounting or a less useful accounting. So just wanted to, I think that's a good caveat to put out there in this accounting. And if you do see inconsistencies in some of those top line numbers, that's probably why. And then Katie mentioned the RFI, or maybe Vicky, you did. In any event, someone did. And just wanted to reinforce that. I think that the agency's interest in your input on what these programs ought to look like is genuine. I think there is a sincere interest in breaking old models where appropriate and really designing programs that work for the new reality rather than just maintaining the inertia that we've had in the past or the status quo. So I think it is worth your while to submit comments to that RFI and be bold if you're so inclined. I mean, there is a lot of flexibility here. And again, I think the agency is genuinely interested in your input. So just wanted to put that PSA out there. Yeah, and more to come. Charlie did reach out to me for my comments on that presentation. With the holidays, I didn't get a chance to get back to him with much feedback, but I think that was a great presentation, Charlie. So nice work. And of course, I'll be here to answer questions as they come up in the future.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ryan. Vicky.
Hi, I was actually going to put the plug in for looking at the RFI as well, but I did want to add a couple of things to what Charlie said, just to provide a little more information and some clarity. There's new CMAQ eligibilities, and one of them is adding to the car sharing to include other micromobility, so like e-scooters and bikes. So that's a cool thing, and I think is applicable for you guys. Fingers crossed that we get guidance on getting waivers for Buy America, and we can start buying CMAQ equipment again. Let's see. Oh, the bridge investment that's discretionary that Charlie talked about. It's important to remember that local governments would be eligible, so like the city and the county, but the MPO, it looks like it's only eligible for MPOs with populations greater than 200,000. So it would definitely have to be a city or county led effort. Oh yeah, and regarding how, how MDT funds things and how the formulas are probably going to remain very similar. Well, that's, based on our asset management and, taking a look at the P3 annually. However, it's by district. So I just wanted to kind of clarify, Missoula area is part of the Missoula district. So, just managing expectations. And that's all I've got. And, thanks, Charlie.
Okay, great. Thanks, Vicky. Shane.
Yeah, I would just echo what Jeremy had said, that, let's start taking advantage now of that potential funding by, start prioritizing and determining which projects we'd like to apply for funding for. The other thing that I would say, though, is that, there's a lot of work involved with that project development and grant management and all of those things. The application, I think, is the easy part. And I guess from our experience on build, we should be prepared to deliver that project and have the staffing available to do that. I just think it takes up more time than you realize. At least that's what I'm finding.
Great. Thanks, Shane. Ellen?
Yeah, I just wanted to put in a plug for the Front and Main project. This is the exact reason why we're moving forward with full-on engineering on that project at this time. We don't have the funding to build it, but we're trying to position it to be competitive with the infrastructure grant funding that's out there. So I hope that will become one of the priority projects for TTAC and TPCC. And that's the conversion to two-way streets.
Okay. Ben.
Thanks. I just wanted to add something. The webinar that I sat on with Charlie and Aaron, I'm not sure, I didn't hear Charlie mention this in when talking about some of those new funding sources, but the timeline that we heard was 180 days after authorization of those funds. And as of the time of the webinar last month, that authorization hadn't happened. And so I guess I have a question for Ryan, and that is, are you any closer to knowing when those funds might be authorized so that starts that 180-day countdown to when the funding might be available?
Yeah, I mean, what I think that's probably in reference to, there's kind of two pieces to the annual funding. We've got the underlying authorization, and that is in place now with the new infrastructure bill as of a couple months ago. But then each year there's, an apportionment exercise that, that's subject to the political winds and which way they're blowing and how much urgency there is. I mean, so you're basically asking the political question. I think, hopefully that'll be resolved by February, and then we'll have actually obligatable funds for the rest of the fiscal year. So hopefully that's resolved next month, but I don't have any special insight into that other interested in engaged political observers might.
Okay,
Thanks.
great,
That is
Ryan.
what I was referring to, that they said that, yeah, those funds would be 6 months after apportionment is when they'd be actually made available.
So, I mean, as an agency, the part that we're responsible for, our staff, I mean, we're prepared to move swiftly as soon as Congress lets us, basically. So that would be my answer to that question, I suppose.
Okay, great. Ellen, you still have your hand up? Did you have another question?
No, I just forgot to lower it.
Okay, all right.
Now I'm done.
Okay. Any other comments, questions? Okay. Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, this is a huge package. Lots of funding in lots of different areas, and hopefully we can benefit here in Missoula from those opportunities and take advantage of them. Okay, if there's nothing else on this agenda item, we will move on to announcements and closing comments. Anyone have anything?
I just have one quick announcement that we have Deborah Postma is on the meeting today. She is our new transportation planner that we just hired. That's going to be sort of a split position between the city and the MPO, really focused on implementation and exactly what we've been talking about today around these grant funds and trying to get projects funded. So excited to have Deborah on. She's coming to us from the city current planning, but also has good experience in transportation planning and some engineering experience and working on project development. So I think it's going to really excited to have Deborah here to help us out on all these projects. So just wanted to introduce her quick to the committee.
Hi, that's me. I'm excited to be here.
Welcome, Deborah.
Welcome, Deborah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. Anything else? All right. If there's nothing else, then we will be adjourned.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Thanks.